She was already falling when she understood. Not the fall itself, not the 130 feet of open air between the Greymere Ridge and the ravine floor, not the wind tearing past her face or the stone walls rushing up. That part she would not be conscious for long enough to process. What she understood, in the single suspended second before the world went vertical, was the face. Kieran's face. 30 yards across the battlefield, through smoke and the press of bodies and the deafening collision of the eastern flank, she had been winning. She had been winning. And he was not watching the fight. He was not commanding. He was not moving toward her. He was watching her fall, and his expression, no horror, no surge forward, no roar of her name tearing out of him the way it should have. The way a mate's name always tears out of you when you see them go down. None of it. Just a stillness. Careful. Deliberate. The stillness of a man watching something he planned come together exactly as intended. Relief. Her mate was relieved. The blade had come from the left. Her left, the flank Davin had covered for 6 years without fail, the flank she trusted the way she trusted the ground beneath her boots. It had punched through the quarter-inch gap between her side plate and her back guard, with the intimate precision of someone who had studied her kit, memorized her movement, and known exactly where to put a knife to finish what a fall might not. Davin had been paid to step aside. She understood all of this in the time it took to hit the ravine edge. Yet the last thing she saw before the drop took her was Kieran lowering his gaze, back to the western push, back to his commands, back to the performance of an alpha managing a battle, as though she had already ceased to exist, as though she were already dealt with. She thought, I should never have given him the chance to choose right. Then there was nothing but air, and then there was stone, and then there was nothing at all. 3 weeks earlier, Senna had found the ledger in a place she was never supposed to be. She had not been snooping. That was the small, bitter irony of it. She had gone to the archive room beneath the Ashvale keep, because the pack's head healer had asked her to retrieve a particular medical record from the pre-Kieran era, a detailed account of a treatment protocol used during the fever outbreak 12 years ago, before either of them held any rank, when old Alpha Marin had still been alive, and the pack had been run with a rougher but more honest hand. The archive room was cold and smelled of dust and old leather. Senna had found the medical record in 20 minutes. She had been heading for the door when the shelf bracket gave way, dry rotted wood and too much weight, and half a shelf of bound records had cascaded across the stone floor in a sliding, rustling avalanche. She had knelt to gather them. She had stacked them by date, because that was how her mind worked. Ordered. Systematic. A warrior's efficiency applied to everything she touched. And in the stacking she had picked up a slim volume, burgundy leather, unmarked on the spine, that had slipped from behind a false panel the falling shelf had partially dislodged. She almost set it aside. Almost. She opened it instead. And read. And felt the cold come in. Not the cold of the archive room, but the specific cold that arrives when the world you thought you were standing on reveals itself to be made of paper. The ledger was old Alpha Marin's private record. His handwriting. She recognized it from pack documents she had reviewed during her first year as Kieran's mate, when she had quietly taken over the pack's administrative disaster because no one else was doing it properly. But this was not administrative record-keeping. This was a confession, written in the meticulous hand of a man who had known he was dying and had wanted, perhaps, to leave some accounting of what had been done to him. The old Alpha had not died in the border skirmish the way the official record stated. He had been poisoned. Slowly, over 4 months, by someone with access to his private quarters, his food, his evening tea. Someone he trusted completely. The ledger named no names directly. The old Alpha had been careful, or perhaps afraid. But it documented the symptoms, the timeline, and one specific detail. A meeting, 2 weeks before his death, with a young enforcer who had come to him with evidence of border corruption and left with a private audience that had lasted 3 hours. The young enforcer's rank insignia, sketched in the margin in Alpha Marin's neat hand, was the silver-threaded crest of the Alpha's personal guard. Kieran had led the Alpha's personal guard at 22. Senna sat on the archive floor for a long time. The cold stone seeped through her training leathers. The dust settled around her. She read the ledger 3 times, not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because she needed to be certain. Absolutely, irrevocably certain. before she decided what to do with the thing she was holding. She was certain by the third reading. She went home, she cooked dinner, she sat across the table from Kieran and watched him eat and talk about the Duskmore border situation, and she said nothing. Not yet. She needed more than one old man's private record. She needed a witness. It took her 9 days to find him. A former pack healer named Oswin, and retired to a small holding at the edge of the western border, who had been present the night the old alpha's symptoms first presented and had kept his silence for years out of fear and a very reasonable interest in staying alive. Senna arrived at his door on a grey Tuesday morning and sat at his kitchen table and put the ledger in front of him and said nothing. He wept. Then he talked. She had everything she needed by that evening. She rode home with the ledger in her pack, and the healer's sworn testimony recorded in her own hand, and a clarity that felt, strangely, like grief. As though the process of confirming the truth had also confirmed the loss of something she had been quietly hoping she was wrong about. She had given Kieran every chance. She needed to believe that. She went to him that night. In their bedroom, where the firelight was amber and the wolves outside were quiet, and everything looked, from a certain angle, like a life that had been worth building. She set the ledger on the table between them. She set the healer's testimony beside it. She folded her hands and looked at the man she had bonded to and said, "I know what you did to Alpha Marin. I have the ledger and a witness. I need you to hear me before you react, Kieran, because what I'm asking is simple. Step down. Tell the council the truth. Let the pack choose the next Alpha through legitimate succession. No one has to know the full detail of how Marin died. You walk away. The pack survives with its integrity intact." Kieran looked at the ledger for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, something moved in the tree line. A night patrol wolf making his rounds, unaware. "You would ask me to give up everything," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to give up a throne you took by murder," Senna said. "That's not everything. That's a correction." He looked up at her. His expression was not the expression she had braced for. Not rage, not denial. It was something more terrible than both. It was the look of a man who had already done his calculation and arrived at his answer before she finished her sentence. "I built this pack," he said. "Everything it is now, the alliances, the territory, the strength, that was me. The old Alpha would have run it into the ground inside a decade. What I did was necessary." "You murdered him," Senna said. Her voice did not shake. She had made a decision somewhere between the archive floor and this room that she would not flinch from what this was. Call it what it is. "I protected the pack. You protected your position." She stood. She picked up the healer's testimony, but left the ledger on the table between them. Let him look at it all night. "The war is at dawn, I know that. The pack needs this fight, and I will not leave them exposed because of what you've done." She met his eyes. "So I'll be on that eastern flank tomorrow. I'll fight for this pack the way I always have. And when we come back, when the border is secured and the pack is safe, you will stand before the council and tell them the truth, or I will." She walked to the door. "Senna." She turned. He was still seated, still calm. His hands rested loose on the armrests of his chair. Too loose, she would think later, for a man who had just been handed a reckoning. "Thank you," he said quietly. For giving me until after." She studied him. The firelight, the ledger on the table, the careful arrangement of his face into something that looked almost like gratitude. She told herself she still wanted to be wrong about him. She walked out. She should never have walked back in. The ravine bottom was cold. That was the first thing. Not pain. Pain requires a body that is still fighting, still insisting on its own continuation. There was no fight left. The fall had seen to that. 130 feet of open air, and then the unforgiving geometry of stone, and whatever argument her body might have made for survival had been settled conclusively on impact. She was aware of herself the way you are aware of a room you are leaving. Dimly, from a growing distance. The cold of the ravine floor. The sound of water nearby, indifferent and continuous. The copper smell of her own blood spreading dark and final across the pale rock beneath her. She thought of the ledger, still on the table in the room she had walked out of. She thought, "He wins." She thought, "No." That was the last coherent thing. That single refusal, quiet and absolute, pressed against the dark like a hand against a closing door. Not rage, not grief. Just the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had never accepted an outcome she had not chosen, pushing back against the one outcome that cannot be pushed. The dark took her anyway. And then, nothing. No corridor. No light. No parade of memories. Just the nothing. Vast and seamless, the way silence sounds when you have never heard anything else. And then, warmth. It arrived the way heat arrives when you step from cold into a room where a fire has been burning for hours. Not sudden, but total. It pressed into her from every direction at once, and with it came the sensation of edges. A body. Hands. Longer than hers, more slender. Lungs drawing breath in a slow, labored rhythm that was wrong, that spoke of something failing. But breathing. Breathing. Alive. Senna opened eyes that were not her eyes and stared at a vaulted stone ceiling hung with tapestries in deep burgundy and black while her mind performed the extraordinary task of understanding what had happened to her. She was dead. She knew that with the certainty of direct experience. She was also somehow here. She raised the hand that was not her hand and looked at it. The longer fingers, the different shape of the knuckle, and the faint tracery of veins beneath pale skin, and breathed through the vertigo of it until the vertigo became manageable, and manageable became something she could work with. She was a warrior. She had walked onto a battlefield this morning, knowing what might be waiting for her. She had made her calculations and accepted her risks, and she had been wrong about the one risk that mattered most. She was not going to be wrong twice. Whatever this was, whatever had brought her back, whatever body she had landed in, whatever life she had been dropped into the middle of, she would use it. She would find her footing. She would find the proof she had left on that table, and she would make Kieran Vale answer for every single choice he had made. She was still deciding exactly how when the door opened. The man who entered was tall, taller than Kieran, broader through the shoulder, with the kind of presence that preceded him into a room the way thunder preceded lightning. He wore no armor, just dark clothing, simple and well-made, and an expression that was doing a great deal of controlled work to hold itself together. His eyes were gray, storm gray, deep-set, and fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing of a stranger's curiosity in it. He knew this face. He had been grieving this face. He crossed the room in 4 strides and dropped to his knees at the bedside and took her hands in both of his, a grip that was desperate and careful in equal measure, and said, in a voice that was completely undone, "Lyra." Senna looked at him, at the grief cracked open on his face, at the hands holding hers like something he had already lost once and could not survive losing again. She looked at the face of Cale Draven, Alpha King, her mate's greatest enemy, and understood exactly how wrong and how dangerous and how impossible her situation was. She also understood with the bone-deep instinct of a warrior who had spent 6 years reading every room she walked into, that this man was not the enemy she had been told he was. She had 1 second to decide. She did not tell him. Not yet. Not here, not like this, with his hands shaking around hers and his gray eyes full of a relief so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. She would need him. She would need this territory, this safety, this man's power and reach to do what she intended to do. And she would tell him the truth. She would, because she was not Kieran. She did not deal in deception as a way of life. But she would choose the moment. She would choose it when she was healed and strong and ready, and not a single day before. She curled her fingers through his, felt the mate bond that had lived in this body before her, faded, a ghost of a thread, but enough to explain the pull she felt toward him, the instinctive recognition of something that fit. "I'm here," she said softly. Not his mate's name, not a lie, just the truest thing she had. Cale bowed his head over their joined hands. His shoulders dropped with a relief that had been carrying too much weight for too long. He had no idea that the woman in his mate's body was an Ashvale warrior who had been murdered by her own mate. He had no idea that she had come back with a purpose that would shatter everything. And in the warmth of his grief and his careful, enormous relief, Senna made herself a promise. She would burn Kieran's world to the ground. But first, she would learn everything there was to know about the man kneeling beside her. She learned to be Lyra in the spaces between the healer's visits and the quiet hours before dawn, between the moments when Kale sat at the chair by her window and read dispatches in silence, and the moments when he looked up and found her watching him with eyes she had not yet learned to school into the right expression. She learned what Lyra had been from what the room told her. The books stacked spine out on the shelf in the order of someone who read with focus and no patience for decoration. The small clay wolf figurine on the windowsill worn smooth at the ears from handling. The particular way the blankets had been folded before she arrived, tight and precise. The habit of a woman who had made her own bed since childhood. She learned what Lyra had been from what Kale didn't say. He was careful with her. Enormously, exhaustingly careful. In the way a man is careful with something he has come terrifyingly close to losing and cannot afford to treat as ordinary ever again. He did not crowd her. He did not demand. He brought her food and sat across the room and asked nothing more than whether she had slept, whether the pain had eased, whether she needed anything. His voice when he spoke to her was low and deliberate, as though he were choosing every word from a very short approved list and discarding everything else. He was grieving, and he was trying not to let it show, and he was so transparently failing at the second part that Senna, who had spent 6 years reading rooms full of people who wanted something and were pretending they didn't, found it almost impossible to look at him directly. He was nothing like what she had been told he was. The Ashvale Pack's understanding of Kale Draven had been assembled from intelligence reports, border incident summaries, and Kieran's own characterizations, and what it amounted to was this: brutal, expansionist, a king who ruled through fear and had earned every enemy he had. Senna had accepted this the way soldiers accept the intelligence they're given, because you had to accept something, or you couldn't function, and she had never had cause to question it directly. She was questioning it now. On the 4th day, she got out of bed. Not with permission, and not carefully. She waited until the healer's morning visit was done and the room was empty, and then she pushed the blankets back and stood, slowly, cataloging the body she was in, the way she would catalog new armor, assessing weight distribution, flexibility, the precise location of the healing wound in her side that was not her wound, that had been in this body before she arrived and was mending faster than it should have been, faster than any ordinary wolf's injury mended. Because Lyra, she was beginning to understand, had not been an ordinary wolf. She crossed to the mirror on the far wall and stood before it and looked. The face that looked back was striking in the way that a winter landscape was striking. All sharp contrast and clean lines, nothing soft about it. High cheekbones, a jaw that came to a decisive point, dark hair falling past her collarbone, thick and straight where Senna's had been wavy. The eyes were the detail that stopped her. Not brown, like hers had been. These were a deep, extraordinary amber, the color of firelight caught in old whiskey, and they held something in their depth that felt familiar in a way she could not explain, as though whatever force had driven her soul into this body had not managed to fully conceal whose eyes they were behind. She raised her hand and touched the glass. "I don't know who you were," she said quietly to the reflection, to Lyra, to the woman whose life she was wearing. "But I will not waste it." Behind her, the door opened. She turned. Kale stood in the doorway, a tray in his hands, taking in the sight of her upright and standing at the mirror, with an expression that moved through relief and something more complicated before it settled into careful neutrality. "You should be resting," he said. "I've been resting for 4 days," Senna said. "I need to move." A pause. His eyes moved over her, assessing, the way warriors assessed each other, measuring what they saw against what they knew. She held still and let him look, and told herself she was simply being patient. "Are you in pain?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Because she would not lie about that. She was not going to lie about anything she didn't have to. "But I've trained through worse." Something shifted in his face. Subtle. A small recalibration happening behind his eyes. Lyra, she understood in that moment, had not said things like that. On Lyra had been many things. The books, the careful habits, the worn clay wolf spoke of a woman of deep interior life. But she had not been this. Not someone who spoke about pain with the flat practicality of someone accounting for resources. "Sit," he said, "please." He set the tray on the table by the window and pulled the chair out for her. not an order, not quite a request. Something in between. From a man who was used to commanding everything in his world and was making a deliberate choice not to command her. She sat. He poured tea. The domesticity of it was so dissonant against everything else that she had to look out the window to keep her face in order. The Alpha King's territory spread below her in the sharp autumn light. A vast, well-ordered landscape of dense forest and structured settlement, training grounds visible through the trees to the east, the pack's main hall rising from the center of it all, in dark stone that looked built to last centuries. It was bigger than she had understood, more formidable, and alive, in the way that healthy packs were alive. Movement everywhere, purpose in it, the particular energy of a community that trusted its leadership. They trusted him. "How long was I unconscious?" she asked. 9 days total, Cale said. He wrapped his hands around his own cup. His knuckles, she noticed, were scarred in the particular pattern that came from years of fighting without gloves. Someone who had learned combat young and hard. "The healers weren't certain you were going to come back." "What happened to me?" she asked carefully. Fishing. She needed to know what Lyra's condition had been, what story she was standing inside. He looked at her steadily. "You were ambushed on the northern road. 3 of our border scouts found you. The men who attacked you were not identified." A beat. Yet. The quiet fury in that last word was contained and absolute. The fury of a man who had not stopped looking. Senna held his gaze. "And before that," she said, "before the road, were we?" She stopped. Recalibrated. She had to do this carefully. She could not ask questions Lyra would have known the answers to. "I feel like there are gaps," she said finally. "Things I should remember that aren't there." Something crossed his face. Pain, quickly controlled. "The healer said that might happen, after what your body went through." He set his cup down. "You don't need to remember everything at once. We have time." She looked at him, at the weight of what he wasn't saying, at the grief he was carrying so carefully, at the way he watched her with an attention that was trying not to be desperate and not fully succeeding. And she thought, "I am going to have to tell him. Not today. Not until she was stronger. Not until she had more of what she needed. But he was going to have to know the truth of what she was, because she could not build what she needed to build on a foundation of deception. And because this man, whatever else he was, did not deserve to be lied to, not by her. She spent 6 weeks inside the Alpha King's keep. In that time, she learned the territory. Not the way a guest learned it, not the formal paths, the presented face of a place, but the way a soldier learned it. She walked every corridor, every training ground, every storage route and exit point. She learned the guard rotation by watching from the window in the hour before dawn, when the shifts changed. She learned the hierarchy by watching who deferred to whom in the Great Hall at meals, and who moved through spaces like they owned them, and who made themselves small. She catalogued everything with the systematic thoroughness that had made her the most effective flank commander in her pack, and filed it in the part of her mind built for exactly this purpose. She also trained. On the 9th day, when her ribs had knitted enough to allow it, and the wound in her side had closed to a scar she was still getting used to seeing in the wrong place on the wrong body, she went to the training ground at first light, before anyone else was there, and spent an hour moving through forms. Combat forms, the kind she had drilled since she was 14, muscle memory so deep that the body she was in picked them up within minutes, finding the patterns even in unfamiliar limbs, because whatever Lyra had been, this body had its own kind of strength, and Senna was learning to use it. She was mid-sequence when she realized she was not alone. Cale was leaning against the fence at the yard's edge with his arms crossed and an expression she couldn't fully read. He had been there long enough that the cold had reddened the back of his neck. He was watching her the way she sometimes caught him watching her in the keep, with that quality of attention that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite getting there. "You never trained like that before," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact delivered by a man gathering data. Senna stopped, held his gaze. She had known this conversation was coming. She had been deciding for 9 days exactly how to have it. "Cale," she said, "sit down. There is something I need to tell you." He went very still. The kind of stillness that preceded either a storm or a decision, Then he unfolded his arms and crossed the yard and sat on the low training bench and looked at her with gray eyes that were already preparing themselves for something they didn't want to hear. She told him. Not all of it. Not yet. Not everything about the ledger and Oswin and what Kieran had done, but the essential truth. She was not Lyra. She had never been Lyra. She was Senna Voss, formerly of the Ashvale pack, formerly the mate of Alpha Kieran Vale, who had arranged her death in a battle he had sent her to fight. She had died in the Greymere ravine and woken up here, in this body. And she did not understand the mechanism of it any more than he did. But she would not lie to him about what she was for a single day longer. She spoke for a long time. He did not interrupt. When she finished, the training yard was quiet, except for wind moving through the pine trees at the fence line. Cale sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and looked at the ground between his boots. Lyra, he said finally, very quietly. Is she gone? Yes, Senna said. She did not soften it. He did not need it softened. I'm sorry. He was silent for a long time. She watched the grief move through him. Not explosively. Not the way grief moved through people who had never learned to hold it. But deeply, like a weight shifting to its final settled position. He had already been grieving. She had not taken that from him. She had only confirmed the shape of what he had lost. The way you moved just now, he said at last. That was combat training. 6 years of it, Senna said. And Vale had you killed why? He murdered his predecessor to take the alpha position, she said. I found the evidence. I gave him the chance to confess and step down. He chose the alternative. Cale looked up. His gray eyes were steady and very cold. Not cold toward her. She understood the difference immediately. The way you understood the difference between a blade drawn against you and a blade drawn on your behalf. You have proof. A ledger in late Alpha Marin's own hand, and a witness who was present the night the poisoning began, she said. The ledger is still in the Ashvale keep. The witness, Oswin, a retired healer, is on Ashvale's western border and has no idea I'm dead. Cale was quiet for another moment. Then something settled in his expression, a decision arriving and taking up its space. What do you need? He asked. It was the right question. Not what do you want, not what are you planning. What do you need? From a man who understood that what she was describing was not revenge as an emotional indulgence, but as a strategic objective requiring resources, and who was already, calmly, offering his. She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was cold and clean across the training yard. The pine trees moved. Somewhere in the keep above them, the pack was waking up. 6 more weeks, she said. To train in this body until I trust it the way I trusted my own. Safe passage to retrieve the witness. And when the time comes, your presence at Ashvale's border. Not your army. Just you. Because what I'm going to do to Kieran Vale needs to be witnessed by someone he cannot dismiss. And there is no one in this territory whose authority he fears more than yours. Cale held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she did not yet have enough information about him to name. 6 weeks, he said. Then we go. She trained like she was building herself from the ground up. Which she was. The body Lyra had left her was strong in ways her own had not been. Faster in the reflexes, more fluid in the hips, built for a different kind of combat than the power-forward style Senna had drilled for years. She had to relearn not the principles, but the application. Where she had relied on momentum and force, this body wanted precision and economy. She adjusted. She always adjusted. Adaptation was the oldest skill she had. Cale trained with her. Not every morning, not officially. But he appeared at the training ground often enough that it became a rhythm. Both of them in the cold pre-dawn, working through sparring sequences that grew harder as her strength built. His gray eyes tracking her movement with the professional attention of a man who took other people's skill seriously and had no patience for false modesty about his own. He was extraordinary. She had known, in the abstract, that the Alpha King's reputation as a fighter was not embellishment. You did not hold a territory like this for 8 years, against the pressure of every neighboring pack that wanted a piece of it, without being genuinely and consistently better than the people trying to take it from you. But knowing it in the abstract and standing across a training yard from him at full speed were different things entirely. and what she discovered was that he fought the way she had always wanted to fight. Intelligent, adaptive, never the same sequence twice, with a quality of physical attention that meant he was always 3 moves ahead and making it look like instinct. She beat him on the 31st day. It was close. 1 opening, 1 decision, 1/2 second of commitment to a feint that he didn't fully track. And she took it and put him on his back in the frost-stiff grass and stood over him breathing hard with her forearm across his throat and waited. He looked up at her. His chest rose and fell. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more private than that. Something that was not performing itself for any audience. "There she is," he said quietly. She stepped back and offered him her hand, and he took it and stood, and they did not speak about it further. But something shifted between them in that moment. Some renegotiation of terms that neither of them had proposed aloud. She was not a guest he was sheltering. She was not a project he was managing. She was an equal, and they both knew it now in the way you only know things you have tested with your body. Wren retrieved Oswin on a Tuesday. He arrived at the Alpha King's keep thin and frightened, and carrying the weight of years of silence like a physical burden, and when Senna sat across from him in the small room off the library, and he looked at her face, Lyra's face, and heard her voice speak things that only Senna Voss could have known, she watched the comprehension move through him, and then the relief, the enormous and shaky relief of a man who had been afraid to speak the truth for years and was finally being handed permission. "I'll testify," he said. "Wherever you need me, I'll testify." "I know," Senna said. "Rest first. We move in 2 weeks." She spent those 2 weeks doing the thing that required more precision than any physical training. She compiled the case. The ledger, she had memorized it word for word before she left the archive room, and she reproduced it now in a clean copy in her own hand. Cross-referenced against Oswin's testimony. Cross-referenced again against the official records of Marin's death that she had reviewed during her first year as Kieran's mate, when she was quietly untangling the pack's administrative mess. She built the document the way she had been taught to build a battle plan. Layered, corroborated, designed so that no single point of attack could bring the whole structure down. She also wrote a letter. 1 copy, sealed. Addressed to the High Council of the Northern Territories, the governing body above individual pack alphas, the authority whose recognition had legitimized Kieran's claim to the Ashvale position in the first place. She did not send it yet. She would deliver it in person. They crossed into Ashvale territory on a morning when the sky was the color of pewter and the trees had lost most of their leaves, and the ground smelled of cold earth and coming winter. Senna rode at Cale's right, not behind him, not flanked by guards as though she needed protection, but beside him, at pace, her spine straight and her hands loose on the reins, and her amber eyes taking in a landscape she had known for 6 years from the inside, and was now reading from the outside for the first time. It looked smaller. Not literally. The territory was what it had always been. Pine forest and hillside, and the particular grey stone that the Ashvale keep was built from, visible now on the ridge above the tree line. But it had the quality of a place seen after long absence, where the scale you held in memory does not match the scale your eyes report, and you understand that what had seemed enormous was partly the enormity of your own feeling about it. She had loved this place once. She had fought for it. She had bled for it, repeatedly, which in retrospect she was reconsidering. "Riders on the eastern approach," said Wren behind them, and Senna had already seen them. 4 of Kieran's border wolves, mounted, moving to intercept at the pace of people surprised by an approach they had not anticipated. She watched them come and felt nothing that resembled fear. What she felt was closer to clarity, the specific sharpening that preceded engagement, her body already adjusting to what was coming, already calculating. The riders pulled up 20 yards ahead. The lead wolf, young, tense, his hand moving toward the blade at his hip before he caught himself, looked between Senna and Cale with the expression of a man who had expected to be managing a routine border check and was now dealing with something significantly above his authority level. "Alpha Draven," he said carefully. "This is Ashvale territory. You're not—" "I know whose territory it is," Cale said. His voice was the voice he used when he had already decided how things were going to go, and was extending the courtesy of informing the other party. "Tell your Alpha he has visitors. Tell him—" He glanced at Senna, the smallest of gestures, The handing over of a cue. Tell him the eastern flank wants a word. Senna watched the border wolf's face as he processed this. She watched him register the phrase and not know what to do with it, and decide that whatever it meant, it was not his problem to solve. He sent a rider ahead at full speed. They rode for the keep. She heard the pack before she saw them, the sound of a community whose alpha's distress signal had just gone through whatever invisible channel connected wolves to their leader, a low collective tension that moved through the settlement like a change in air pressure before a storm. Wolves stopping in doorways, children being pulled inside, the guard on the keep wall doubling in the 3 minutes it took to ride from the tree line to the gate. And then the gate opened. Because Cale Draven was outside it and refusing it entry was not a decision a gate guard was authorized to make. The courtyard was stone-flagged and wide and full of people who had found reasons to be there in the last 4 minutes. Which was to say, it was full of people who had come to watch. Word moved fast in packs. It always had. Senna rode in beside Cale and felt 200 pairs of eyes find her with the particular attention that strangers always received in tight communities. Assessing, categorizing, searching for threat or context or both. She let them look. She was looking too, for faces she knew, for Davin, who had stepped aside on the eastern flank and left her left unguarded and whom she intended to locate before the day was out. For the council members who had spent years working to make her invisible and would shortly discover what invisible people were capable of when you stopped watching them. For Kieran, he came out of the keep's main doors with the contained speed of a man who had been told something was wrong and had come to handle it personally, which was both his greatest strength and, she knew, his most reliable pattern. He was still exactly as she remembered, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, wearing authority the way he wore his clothing, as though it had been tailored specifically for him. He crossed the courtyard with 4 of his senior wolves at his back, and his eyes already on Cale, already managing the diplomatic geometry of an uninvited alpha on his land. He had not looked at her yet. She watched him approach and felt the mate bond, the ghost of it, the memory of it, the thing that had once been the deepest tether in her life, and felt nothing. Not grief, not longing, not even anger in this moment. Just purpose. Draven, Kieran said, stopping 10 feet away. His voice was controlled. His eyes moved to Senna with the assessing glance he gave any unfamiliar wolf in his territory, cataloging threat level, rank, affiliation. This is unexpected, and your companion. My name is Lyra Draven, Senna said. The name felt strange in her mouth. Necessary, but strange. Not yet. She was not ready to say her real name yet. There was a sequence to this, and she intended to follow it. Your Alpha King was kind enough to escort me. Kieran looked at her. His brow drew together slightly. Something in her voice. Something in the way she held herself. Something he could not identify and could not dismiss snagging at the edge of his awareness. Have we met? He said. No, Senna said. She held his gaze with eyes that had once been brown and were now amber, and gave him nothing. But I know a great deal about you. She reached into the satchel at her side and removed a sealed document. Not the letter to the High Council. Not yet. That was the endgame. But the first piece. A certified copy of the case she had built, signed by Oswin and notarized under Draven's seal. She held it out. I think, she said pleasantly, we should go inside. Kieran took the document. He broke the seal. He read the first page. She watched the color leave his face. It left slowly, not all at once, but in stages, the way blood leaves a wound, as the words on the page assembled themselves into something his mind recognized and immediately, desperately, did not want to be true. She watched him reach the paragraph that quoted the ledger directly. She watched his jaw set. She watched his eyes lift from the page and find her face with an entirely new quality of attention, no longer assessing a stranger, but searching, with the first cold thread of something that was not yet fear but was becoming it. Who are you? He said. Not a question, a demand. Read the rest, Senna said. I said, who are you? Kieran. Oswin's voice. From behind her, where Wren had brought him forward on her signal, the old healer thin and pale and trembling slightly but present, entirely present, his eyes on Kieran with the expression of a man who had been afraid for a very long time and had decided today that he was done. Kieran went absolutely still. I was there, Oswin said. His voice shook, but it did not stop. "The night Marin's symptoms began. You came to his chambers. I was in the adjoining room. I heard everything." The courtyard was silent. Every wolf in it had heard. Senna had made certain of the timing for exactly that reason. Not in a closed room. Not in a council chamber where things could be managed and contained and officially denied. Here. In the open. In front of the pack. Because the pack deserved to know. Kieran looked from Oswin to the document in his hand to Senna. And in his expression she could see the machinery of him working. Calculating, assessing options, looking for the angle that got him out of this the way he had found angles out of everything else for 15 years. "This is fabricated," he said, loud enough for the courtyard, controlled. "This is a rival alpha's political play. Whatever this woman has told you, Oswin, whatever she has promised you." "She didn't tell me anything I didn't already know," Oswin said. "I want her detained," Kieran said, turning to his wolves. "Both of them. This is Ashvale territory, and I am—" "You are an alpha whose claim to that title I am formally contesting," Kale said. His voice carried across the courtyard without effort, the way voices did when they were accustomed to being the last word in any room. Every head turned. Kale sat his horse with the loose authority of a man who had never once questioned whether the ground beneath him was his, and looked at Kieran Vale with grey eyes that were offering absolutely nothing. "Under High Council law, Article 14, Kale continued, "a formal contest of alpha succession requires immediate suspension of enforcement authority pending investigation. You cannot detain anyone in this courtyard today. You cannot order anything in this courtyard today." He let a single beat of silence sit. "You can listen." Kieran's wolves looked at each other. Looked at their alpha. Looked at the document being passed hand to hand through the crowd that had gathered at the courtyard edges, the words on it moving through the pack like fire through dry grass. Kieran looked at Senna, and she saw it. The moment the calculation collapsed. The moment he looked at this woman in a face he had never seen, with eyes that held something older than the face that held them, and felt the first true cold of what was happening settle into him. "Who?" he said, very quietly now, all performance stripped out of it. "Are you?" Senna looked at the man who had sent her to a battlefield with orders for her execution, at the man who had thanked her for giving him time and used that time to arrange her death, at the man who had watched her fall and felt relief. She had planned this moment for 6 weeks. She had decided, in the cold logic of the training yard and the quiet hours of the keep, exactly how she wanted it to happen. Controlled, sequential, a legal dismantling conducted in full view of the people it affected most. That was still the plan. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was not the careful prepared sentence she had rehearsed. What came out was her name. "Senna," she said. "Senna Voss, your mate. The one you had killed on the eastern flank 6 weeks ago." She tilted her head exactly the way she had always tilted it when she wanted him to understand that she had already won an argument he hadn't realized they were having. I came back. Did you miss me?" The sound that went through the courtyard was not a gasp. It was larger than that. It was the sound of 200 wolves processing something that restructured everything they thought they knew. A collective lurch of comprehension that moved through the pack like a physical wave. Kieran did not make a sound. His face did something she had never seen it do in 6 years. It simply failed. Every structure of control he had built over 15 years of calculated performance failed all at once, and what was underneath it was not guilt and not remorse, but something older and more animal. Fear, pure, unmanaged. The fear of a man looking at the thing he had destroyed and discovering it was still standing. Good, Senna thought. And then the keep doors behind Kieran slammed open, and the woman who came through them stopped everything. She was tall, polished, wearing the particular composed expression of someone who had been warned and had come anyway, because being warned had never stopped her before. Senna recognized her from council briefings she had attended in her first year. Councilwoman Rhea Calloway, 60 years old and sharp as surgical steel, who had spent Senna's entire time in this pack working quietly and persistently to remove her from it. Who had, Senna now understood with the cold clarity of everything assembling into its final shape, been working with Kieran long before the ledger was ever found. Rhea looked at Senna across the courtyard, and Senna saw in her eyes something that was not fear and not guilt, but calculation. Still calculating even now, the way a predator calculated an escape route even as the trap closed. "She's lying," Rhea said clearly. "Whatever she's told you, whatever that document claims, she is a Draven operative, and this is a fabrication designed to destabilize this pack. Don't listen to—" "Rhea," Senna said. The woman stopped. "I know you helped him," Senna said. Quiet, even. The way she spoke when she was most certain. "I know the poisoning wasn't only his plan. I know whose idea it was to use the battle to finish what the poison started." She paused. "And I have a second document. One Oswin wasn't the only signatory on." The color left Rhea Calloway's face the same way it had left Kieran's. In the same stages. In the same direction. "That's not—" Rhea started. "Possible?" Senna said. "I know. I'm dead. Remember?" She reached into the satchel and produced the second document and held it out to the nearest wolf. Not to Kieran, not to Rhea, but to a mid-rank female wolf standing at the courtyard's edge, who Senna had watched over the last hour with the particular quality of attention she gave to people who were paying the most careful attention themselves. "Read it out," Senna said, "loud enough for everyone." The wolf took the document, looked at it, looked at Senna, and something in the amber eyes looking back at her, something old and unbreakable and entirely unafraid, made her decision for her. She began to read. Senna turned back to Kieran as the words moved through the courtyard. She watched him listen to the account of his own crime being read aloud to his pack in his own home, and she felt the rightness of it. Not satisfaction exactly, not yet, but the particular feeling of a thing being restored to its correct shape after a long time spent deformed. She was watching his face when it happened. The calculation came back. She saw it arrive, saw the moment he stopped listening to the words being read and started listening to something else, something internal, some remaining structure of strategy identifying an exit that the rest of him had missed. She had seen that look before. She had seen it across the dinner table the night she told him she knew what he had done. She had told herself that night that it was the look of a man deciding to confess. She knew better now. "Ren," she started. Too late. Kieran moved, not for her, not for Kale. He moved for Oswin, the witness, the living piece of the case that a document could not replace. Crossing the courtyard in 3 strides, with a speed that only an alpha at full force could manage, his hand going to the blade at his hip. And every wolf in the yard froze for the half-second it took to process what was happening, because nobody, in 200 years of pack record, had ever drawn a blade against a civilian elder in their own courtyard. Nobody except Kieran Vale. Senna was already moving. She crossed the distance between them in the time it took him to clear the blade from its sheath, and she hit him from the side. Not a tackle, not the momentum and force style of her old body, but the precise, economical strike she had spent 6 weeks learning in Lyra's form, on driving her elbow into his forearm with a force that separated the blade from his grip and sent it skittering across the flagstones. And then she had his wrist locked behind him, and her forearm across his throat from behind, and they were both very still. The courtyard was silent. Kieran breathed hard. She could feel it. The rage in him, the desperation, the absolute disbelief of a man who had planned her death and was being physically restrained by a woman he had never expected to see again in a body he did not recognize. "You're fast," he said. Low. For her alone. There was something ugly in it. Something that wanted to be contempt, but was running out of ground to stand on. "I had 6 weeks and an exceptional teacher," Senna said. Her voice was level. Her hold was not moving. "And I'm not the one who needs to be fast right now, Kieran. I'm the one who already won." "This isn't over," he said. She felt him gather, felt the shift in his weight, that meant he was preparing to use his full alpha strength to break the hold, to escalate, to burn everything down before he let it be taken from him. And she tightened her grip and leaned in and said, very quietly, directly against his ear, "I know about the second ledger, Kieran." He went still. "The one you kept," she said. "Not Marin's, yours. The record you've maintained for 15 years of every arrangement and every payment and every wolf who has ever done something for you that couldn't go through official channels. I know it exists because you are the kind of man who writes things down, because you don't fully trust anyone, and you want leverage, and I know where you keep it because I spent a year managing every administrative corner of this keep, and there is not a locked room in it I don't have the map of." She paused. "Is it still behind the false wall in the Eastern Archive?" she said. Or did you move it?" The silence that came off him was the loudest thing she had ever heard. He had not moved it. She released him and stepped back and looked at Cale, who had watched the entire sequence from horseback, with an expression that was, for the first time since she had known him, entirely unguarded. He was looking at her the way people looked at things they had not been expecting and could not look away from. "The Eastern Archive," she said to Wren. "Second shelf from the floor, behind the wall panel on the left. Go now, before he finds a way to send someone first." Wren was already dismounting. Kieran turned to face her. The blade was gone. The calculation was gone. The performance was gone. What stood in the middle of the courtyard wearing his face was something stripped down to its actual composition. A man who had built his entire existence on a lie that was now, brick by brick, being taken apart in front of the people whose belief in him was the only thing that had ever made it real. "You can't," he started. "I already have," Senna said. She watched him understand it. Watched the moment it landed, fully, completely, without any remaining exit, that there was no version of this he was walking out of intact. And then Wren came back through the keep doors. He was carrying a leather-bound volume, black cover, unmarked spine, and every wolf in the courtyard watched Kieran Vale's last defense walk across the flagstones in someone else's hands. Nobody spoke. The courtyard held its breath while Wren crossed the flagstones with the black ledger in his hands, and 200 wolves stood in the particular silence of people watching something irreversible happen. The kind of silence that doesn't return to ordinary noise afterward. The kind that becomes a before and after. Kieran watched it come. He did not move, did not reach for it, did not order anyone to intercept, did not attempt the next calculation. Whatever machinery had kept him functional for 15 years of careful, constructed power had finally, in the last 3 minutes, run out of road. He stood in the center of his own courtyard and watched his private ledger travel toward the woman he had killed, and his face was the face of a man arriving at the end of something. Senna took the ledger from Wren. She did not open it. She did not need to. The wolves around her did not need to see its contents to understand what its existence meant. That their alpha had kept a private record of every corrupt arrangement, every payment, every favor exchanged in the dark. Because men like Kieran always did. Because trust was a tool and leverage was insurance. And he had never once in his life believed that the ground beneath him was solid enough to stand on without something buried underneath it. She set it on top of the other documents and looked at him. "This goes to the High Council today," she said. "All of it. Marin's ledger, Oswin's testimony, Ria's correspondence, and yours. The formal contest of succession is already filed under Cale Draven's seal. The council will send adjudicators within the week." She paused. "It's done, Kieran. It was done before we rode through your gate." He looked at her for a long moment. The anger was gone. The calculation was gone. What remained was something raw. The look of a man finally forced to see himself from the outside, in the reflection of what he had done to get here, and finding the view insupportable. "You're dead," he said. Quiet, almost to himself. "I watched you fall." "You did," Senna said. "And yet." She turned to the wolf who had read the document aloud, the mid-rank female at the courtyard's edge, whose name she had since learned was Dara, and who had read every word with a steadiness that had cost her something, and given the pack everything. "Take Oswin inside," Senna said. "Keep him somewhere warm. He's done enough for one morning." Dara nodded. She moved. And in moving she did something that Senna had not planned for and did not expect. She stopped beside Senna first and looked at her with dark, direct eyes and said simply, "We knew something was wrong. We just didn't know what." Senna held her gaze. "You know now," she said. "Yes," Dara said, "we do." She took Oswin by the arm and walked him through the crowd, which parted for them without being asked. Senna watched them go. Then she looked at Cale. He had dismounted at some point in the last few minutes. She hadn't noticed when, and was standing a few feet behind her left shoulder in the place a second-in-command stood, which was not the place an Alpha King stood, and which told her something she added quietly to everything else she knew about him. He caught her look. His expression gave her nothing dramatic. Just steadiness. And just, "I'm here." It was, she thought, the most useful thing anyone had ever offered her. The High Council adjudicators arrived in 4 days. 3 of them, senior wolves from the neutral territories, carrying the authority of the governing body that sat above all pack alphas and whose decisions could not be overturned by any single leader, however powerful. They set up in the Ashvale Great Hall and spent 2 days reviewing documents, hearing testimony, and conducting the kind of methodical institutional review that was the opposite of dramatic, and was, nonetheless, the most important thing that happened that week. Senna testified for 3 hours on the second day. She sat across from 3 strangers in a hall where she had once sat at the Alpha's table and been made to feel like a guest, and she gave her account in the same voice she had used to report battle intelligence. Precise, sequential, without embellishment, because the facts were sufficient, and had always been sufficient, and the only reason they had not been heard before was that the person they implicated had been very careful about who was in the room. She was not careful about who was in the room. She asked for the doors to stay open. The pack filled the hall corridor and the courtyard outside it, and listened through every window. On the morning of the 3rd day, the adjudicators delivered their ruling. Kieran Vale's alpha succession was declared illegitimate. His claim to the Ashvale title was formally dissolved. He was stripped of rank, removed from the succession register, and remanded to council custody pending trial for the murder of Alpha Marin and the attempted murder of his own mate. Rhea Calloway was arrested on 4 counts of conspiracy. Davin, who had, to absolutely nobody's surprise, attempted to quietly leave the territory on the first night, was intercepted at the southern border by Wren, who had anticipated this with the equanimity of a man who had seen cowardice before and knew its patterns. Davin was brought back. Davin was charged. When the ruling was read in the Great Hall, the pack did not cheer. That was not what it felt like. It felt like a long-held breath finally released. The sound of a community exhaling something it had been carrying without fully knowing the weight of it. They had known, in the way wolves always knew, that something in the foundations of their pack was wrong. They had not had a name for it. Now they did. Senna stood at the back of the hall and listened to the ruling and felt the thing she had promised herself she would feel when this moment came, the completion of it, the rightness of a debt being settled, and found that it was quieter than she had expected. Not smaller, just quieter. Like the difference between a storm and the morning after one, when the damage is visible and the air is clean, and there is only the work of what comes next. She had expected to feel triumphant. She felt instead free. The adjudicators asked her, and on the last morning, what she wanted. It was a formal question with specific legal implications. She was the wronged party in a succession dispute. She had been the Alpha's mate. She had died in this territory and returned to it. And the council's framework had very particular rules about what was owed to people in her situation. They could restore her formal status. They could grant her a claim to the Ashvale Alpha position in her own right, given her bloodline and her demonstrated capacity. They could award reparations. They had a list of options, and they walked her through it with the careful thoroughness of people who understood that what they were offering was significant. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Give the pack the right to choose their own alpha through legitimate succession. Open it. Let whoever the wolves choose lead them." She paused. "And the house my father led. The Holloway remnants' old territory on the western edge. Give that to me." The adjudicators looked at each other. "That's all?" the senior one asked. "That's all?" Senna said. She did not want the Ashvale Alpha position. She had watched what that position had done to the person who held it, what the hunger for it had cost, what protecting it had required, what it had made of a man who might, in some other life, have been something other than what he became. She wanted no part of that inheritance. She wanted the Holloway land because it had been her father's, because it was the place she had learned to read forest floors and track owl migrations, and understand that the world had its own order that had nothing to do with who was alpha of what, because it was, in every way that mattered, home. She rode west that afternoon, alone, which she had specified, because there were things she needed to do in her own company, things that required the specific privacy of standing in a place that held memory, and letting the memory settle into its new context without an audience. The Holloway land was quiet and overgrown, and smelled of pine and cold water, and the particular mustiness of a place that had been left to itself for years, and was doing just fine. She stood at the edge of the tree line where she had once dropped out of an oak tree, in front of a young beta enforcer, and explained about owl migration patterns. And she looked at the land that had been her father's and was now hers, and she breathed. She was alive. She was in a body that was not the one she had been born in. She was standing in a landscape that was entirely familiar to her soul and entirely new to her face. And she was, despite every variable, more fully herself than she had been in 6 years of being somebody's mate in somebody else's keep. She heard the horse behind her and did not turn. "I said alone," she said. "You said you needed to do something alone," Cale said. "You didn't say anything about after?" She turned. He was dismounted, standing at the edge of the tree line with his reins loose in one hand, and his gray eyes holding the careful attention that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he considered important. He had ridden hard to get here. There was road dust on his coat, and he had not stopped to change out of it. She looked at him for a moment. "You heard what I told the council," she said. "I'm not taking a pack position. I'm not going back to Draven territory as anything with a title. I don't know what I am yet, in this body, in this life. I'm not a settled thing, Cale. I want you to understand that before you say whatever you came here to say." "I know," he said. "I'm not here to offer you a title." "Then what are you here for?" He was quiet for a moment. The pine trees moved. A bird called somewhere in the canopy above, something small and persistent, indifferent to everything happening below it. "Lyra and I were matched by the council," he said. "Politically. We respected each other. We were building something functional, and I grieved her. I meant every moment of that grief. But what we had was an agreement between two people who were trying to do right by their packs." He paused. "What I feel when I watch you is not an agreement." Senna looked at him. "You beat me on the 31st day," he said. "No one has beaten me in 4 years. I've been thinking about it since." "The takedown?" she said. "Or the fact that I beat you?" "Both," he said. The corner of his mouth moved. "If I'm being precise." She looked at the land around her. Her father's trees, her mother's ridgeline, visible above the canopy to the north. The place she had been before she was anyone's mate or anyone's warrior or anyone's problem. The place she had been just Senna, girl with a field notebook, climbing trees to count owls, entirely unconcerned with the politics of who held what territory. She was not that girl anymore. She was something harder and stranger and more complicated, in a body that still surprised her sometimes in mirrors, and carrying the memory of a death that had not finished her. But the land was still the land. And the man behind her was still standing in it, having ridden hard and said the honest thing without dressing it up, which was, she was finding, the quality she valued most in people, having spent 6 years with a man who dressed everything up. She did not fall into his arms. That was not who she was, and he would not have wanted it even if it had been. She understood that about him now, with the certainty of someone who had trained beside a person and seen the real composition of them. He did not want someone to catch. He wanted someone to stand next to. She turned around fully and walked back to where he stood and stopped in front of him, and looked up at the gray eyes that had been steady through every difficult thing in the last 6 weeks, and said, "I'm going to rebuild this land, the Holloway territory. I'm going to make it something. It will take time, and it will not be simple, and I will not be putting anyone's priorities above what I'm building here." "I know," Cale said, "and I will not be called a Luna or a mate or a consort or any other word that means I come second," she said. "If whatever this is between us becomes something, we are equal or we are nothing." "Senna," he said, "you put me on my back in a training yard and then walked into an enemy pack and dismantled their alpha with a ledger and a retired healer. I think we both know I'm not going to be the one setting terms." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly. Real, unguarded, the kind of laugh that happens before you've decided to allow it. And it surprised her enough that she pressed her hand to her mouth for a second the way you did when something caught you off guard. He was smiling. Not the careful, contained expression she had catalogued in the keep. A real one, with warmth in it, spreading slowly like heat from a fire that had just been properly lit. "Stay for a while," she said. "Help me figure out what this land needs. Then we see." "Then we see," he agreed. He tied his horse to the fence post at the land's edge. The same fence post she had climbed over at 17 to get to the oak tree on the other side. and they walked the property together in the cold autumn light. She showed him where the creek ran, and where the old pack structures had stood, and where the owl colony nested in the high branches of the eastern pines. He listened with the quality of attention that she had learned was simply who he was. All of it. Nothing withheld. The sky above the tree line went from gray to gold to the deep amber of late afternoon. The light settled across the pines and made everything it touched look like it had always been this color. Senna walked her father's land in a body that was not her birth body, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly account for, that where she was and who she was were the same answer to the same question. She was Senna Voss. She had died and come back. She had burned a corrupt kingdom to the ground with paperwork and a retired healer and an opponent who underestimated her, which was honestly the most satisfying way it could have gone. She was standing on land that was hers, in a life that was hers, next to a man who had not once asked her to be smaller than she was. Kieran Vale was in council custody. Rhea Calloway was facing 4 charges. Davin had been caught at the border like the coward he was. The Ashvale pack was free to choose who led them next. And somewhere in the high branches of the eastern pines, something moved. A shadow, large-winged, lifting out of the canopy with a slow, unhurried sweep. An owl. The same species she had been tracking at 17. The colony that had brought her across the fence line in the first place. Still there. Senna watched it rise until it was just a shape against the gold sky. And then nothing. And then gone. She had been thrown off a cliff by the man who was supposed to protect her. She had died. She had come back. And she had not wasted a single moment of it. If this story found you at the right time, if Senna's fire lit something in you, hit that like button right now. It tells me this is the kind of story you want more of, and I read every single one. Drop in the comments. Were you Team Senna from the beginning, or did Kale win you over somewhere along the way? Because I have a feeling this comment section is about to tell me exactly which scene did it. And I want to know. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.